What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through why I treat backend systems like invisible growth engines, how I'm actively thinking about building these growth engines through Killer Chaos OS, which is our internal operating system that ultimately fuels how we build backend infrastructure, and also how we're actively planning for it into the future. Like always, with the main mission of these videos is to build our thinking OS, basically our internal operating system, like I said, that powers the vision of the backend systems that we're actively building for, and also just to call in visionaries, which are the people that are aligned with the mission of what it is that we're actively striving to solve for, and ultimately to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So most people, in my case at least from my understanding and my experience, is that most people focus and obsess over the front end, which are websites, ads, and branding. But in my experience, I've seen that the real power is hidden behind the curtains. And what this basically means is the backend systems that are ultimately fueling what's going on the back end instead of the front end is where the leverage lies, because the back end systems are the things that ultimately multiply the leverage and also multiply the level of impact that that business has in the long term. They multiply quietly as well, so it's one of those things that I've at least experienced firsthand, that it's not the flashiest thing to ultimately say, hey, we build back end infrastructure, or taking a look at the back end to see what actually fuels the websites and the branding and all these things that are on the front end, but rather looking at it from a perspective of saying, hey, this quietly multiplies the output without demanding constant effort. And what this basically means is that it's one of those tools in your web stack that you ultimately have that quietly compounds as you're actively running your business. So what this means is that with every workflow, for me, I design it in a sense that it ultimately compounds. What this basically means is I've broken down into 3-4 different things which ultimately define how it actively compounds silently, which are how I track a lead in the CRM, how I'm actively integrating and putting a lead and also tracking that, because that's ultimately something that compounds within the system. And through that, it also means that the trigger that moves data between Airtable plus Google Sheets, ultimately these are the backend infrastructure plays that ultimately builds the business. Because in my experience, I've at least found that one of the most quiet leverage tools that you can actively have within your business is ultimately having these backend systems super dialed. Because in as much as these flashy to have the best websites and the best ads and the best branding, I think where the quiet leverage lies is ultimately in the backend infrastructure. And how do we actively see this? It's ultimately how we're actively logging in daily sales ops metrics, because this ultimately tells you how your business is doing from a sales perspective, and how you're actively logging this ultimately keeps you accountable to keeping your sales side of the business super dialed in, because you understand your metrics. And I think metrics are one of the most crucial modes that you need to have within your business, because if you're able to understand that, hey, we're below KPI or we're above KPI, you can ultimately make decisions from this, and ultimately asking the question of what part of Killer Chaos OS gets automated next, because this is also another crucial aspect to it, because there's so many moving parts in terms of how you're able to go about building these growth engines that ultimately multiply quietly. And I think one of the unflashy parts about this especially is that each tweak ultimately feels small. I think most people want to feel this grammarless like XYZ tweak, and then it ultimately yields this massive return immediately, which I do understand. I think we're living in a world where fast paced is ultimately good. But through this, it ultimately takes an understanding that, hey, building backend infrastructure and systems that power the business is something that is invisible but ultimately compounds over time. And this ultimately comes in as a growth system that ultimately multiplies with time. And through this, it's a cumulative effort, which is the backend that never sleeps. So the backend never sleeps. It is ultimately running on a day-to-day, ensuring that your business is ultimately running, smoothly on a day-to-day. Because without, a backend system, you ultimately are able to, you're able to just, crank out what you need to do. But at a certain level of scale, you ultimately cannot take it a step further. And that's why, just building building out these backend systems that never sleep, never forgets, and also never slows down, this ultimately acts as a multiplying effect within your business. But one of the most, things that, I'm actively, trying to get better at communicating is how this is an invisible layer in the business. And I think a lot of, people may not understand this, this specific part in terms of how the backend systems ultimately fuel how the business is run. Because with the backend system, if you have a solid backend system, you can reduce churn, you can ultimately super dial in and get higher LTV. Say for example, you're running an app and you're ultimately able to super dial how you actively able to communicate with your clients. Say they are unhappy about disputes and things like that. If you're able to just hear what they have to say, and ultimately you have that super dialed within the backend systems, you have your retention tactics, and also just how you're able to make sure that your machine is well oiled and running. I think ultimately it's one of those things that silently compound, because it's ultimately easy to say, hey, we're not making as much, let's just spend more on ad spend. But what if the one thing that you needed to do in your specific business was ultimately to keep clients longer? And how would you have gone through that? Ultimately by tightening up the ship from the back. And that is ultimately the small tweaks that ultimately compound over time. Because for me, at least I've experienced a lot of things in life, if not all things in life, ultimately resort as a form of habit. And these different habits that compound over time can ultimately dictate how you're bleeding cash. And how you're bleeding cash comes in many different form factors, and it's not just one singular point, at least in my experience, that hey, we ultimately people are just leaving all of a sudden. If you ask those questions by asking the questions of, okay, why are people leaving, what is the indications that ultimately led to people leaving, and you gather that information, you can ultimately get to the root of what it is that ultimately led to that compounding effect that boiled to the reason why they left. And through this you can ultimately understand why this matters, which is leverage. Leverage is one of the biggest moats that ultimately backend systems gives you, because it compounds your effort even when you're offline. At least I found in so many cases that even when you're not actively working, because us as human beings and people, we can ultimately just work for so long, and ultimately you need to build in backend infrastructure and systems that ultimately allow you to continue doing what you're doing without you actively being there. And through this, it ultimately allows you to then build it while you're offline, saying, hey, it's not directly as a result of your constant day-to-day input, but ultimately you've built this machine and it is able to run with or without you. All you have to do is just ultimately just maintain it for the long run. But ultimately this also means clarity. Through clarity, clean systems surface the signal from the noise. I see reality faster than everyone else because I've built that level of clarity through the surface of saying, hey, this level of clarity surfaces where the signal from noise is, and ultimately allows me to understand that, hey, each and every single moment we need to be able to understand what is actively causing us to not have clarity. And through that level of clarity that we then gain, we're able to build better systems because we have a sound mind as well. And I think building systems comes from ultimately having a structured internal operating system, which ultimately governs how you're able to log decisions and ultimately think of solutions, thinking of OS, not in the sense of like Mac OS and things like that, but ultimately an internal operating system as to how you function as a person and how you're able to solve problems. And I think this is one of the most important modes that ultimately drives clarity, because the sharper your own internal operating system is, the sharper you're able to build and crank things out. And through that, it ultimately creates predictability, which means that a systemized backend reduces randomness and gives you consistent outputs that I can ultimately trust. And this comes from pattern recognition, ultimately saying that each and every single build that we are able to build, we spot patterns within the system that ultimately we can then predict into the future and actively build possible solutions that we can simulate. And through these simulations we can actively run possible outcomes that may come, and through this we can ultimately just guide and refine our machine that ultimately builds that optionality, like I've spoken in my previous video, that gives you flexibility. Because I think one of the most important things is that when you're able to be flexible and not just super rigid in terms of building our backend systems and making sure that you're building this system to last a long time, but also adding this modularity, which I've I've also spoken about in a different video. I think this ultimately scales your level of impact and also understands all and also helps you understand, these patterns that form. Because I think, just pattern recognition, once you spot the patterns and you're able to train, your system to recognize these patterns, you're able to then predict what could possibly happen into the future. But through this, I think it's about engineering certainty, not just chasing hacks or guesswork. I think data points are one of the most important things that we could possibly form on a day-to-day basis. That's why we're making these videos on a day-to-day basis, because we just want to gather data points of where we're actively succeeding and where we're actively failing as well, because through that we're able to build better systems that ultimately allow us to get closer to the main vision of Killer Chaos OS, which we're actively building for on a day-to-day. And it excites me so much to just wake up each and every single day and know that we're cranking towards this vision, because ultimately we're going to be creating a lot of value into the future that ultimately scales our level of impact and inspires millions of people. Wouldn't that be a cool feature to ultimately say, hey, we're actively building the next generation of backend systems that ultimately allows, our users or our clients to ultimately 10x their business is impact? I think that was something worth exciting getting is something worth getting excited, waking up to. And I think each and every single day, it ultimately just refines on our mission, how we're actively building, and also making sure that we're building, these backend systems like invisible growth engines. And through these invisible growth engines, we're actively able to, just scale the level of impact on the backend on something that, is not, the most glamorous or, charming to use, but ultimately it gets the job done and it ultimately creates value in the long run. And not just designing rules and automations that create momentum in the background, and just ultimately scaling the level of impact, like I've said, because that's why Killer Chaos OS isn't just about tracking. It's about architecting invisible engines that scale without asking for more energy. I think one of the most important, modes that, I want, the vision of Killer Chaos OS to ultimately have is be the backend silent infrastructure play that businesses ultimately inject into their business to scale their level of impact. And I think once we're actively able to just think things through and ultimately build the vision of Killer Chaos OS in the manner that we need to, by simply just laying down the foundation in terms of how we're actively thinking through our internal operating system, how we're logging decisions, gathering data points, and also structuring our feedback as well, ultimately using this, as the mode that ultimately drives the next generation of backend infrastructures that we're going to be building, but also scaling the level of impact that we'll have into the future. And I think, scaling, this without more energy on our, client side is ultimately a vision that is going to be super difficult. But I think, the more difficult it is, the more exciting it is. And I think, what is life worth if you're not actively building for hard goals and actively striving for the most difficult thing, like doing 100 videos. 100 videos is absolutely nuts if you think about it. We're 78 days into this, this 100-day videos that we're actively building towards. But oh my days, it's been one of the most that has ultimately driven a lot of things that, I've been able to actively learn and also just refine within myself, because I didn't know like that I would be able to, learn so much on a day-to-day by actively just shipping, not thinking, hey, this needs to be perfect XYZ, let's actively just make this document and actively just ship each and every single day, press record and see what happens. I didn't expect anything to happen, but I think one of the biggest modes that I've been able to ultimately drive this year, especially in terms of my thinking OS, is ultimately just building in public and also just sharing how I'm actively solving how I'm actively solving for XYZ and also building for the future. And this front end ultimately sells the dream, because that is true. The front end ultimately sells the dream of what it actively is into the future, but the back end is what makes it real. I think a lot of things in life are ultimately powered by the silent things that are at play. I think most importantly, owning that infrastructure layer is ultimately where the gold is at. If we're the ones that are actively building the next generation of backend systems, I think that is a future worth getting excited excited to. If we're able to just keep pushing and hitting the nail in the wall on a day-to-day and saying, hey, we're using these videos as a moat or a stepping stone or a foundation to ultimately refine our thinking and how we're able to build into the future, and knowing that, hey, we'll get things wrong, we'll get some things right as well, but ultimately we're actively shipping and compounding, this leverage that we're actively building, and making sure that, hey, what we're building is not glamorous, it's not the most cool thing to actively think about on a day-to-day, but I think one of the most important modes is that we keep driving and keep shipping each and every single day, because the closer we get to the goal, the more we're able to scale our level of impact. And I know we're still early, still early, but I think these videos are going to be the foundation that ultimately builds the vision of Killer Chaos OS. And I think one day we're going to be looking back on these videos and being like, hey, like, we got some of these things right and we got some of these things wrong, but the most important thing is that we actively just shipped each and every single day. And this is why I think backend systems are ultimately the invisible growth engines that ultimately power the vision of the business, and also creates that ROI into the long term. Still a lot of skills to stack, still a lot of different plays at force that we're actively just going to be learning and compounding each and every single day. But I'm excited. I think one of the most important things is just keeping that same level of energy and excitement that, hey, we're building the vision of Killer Chaos OS, and we're going to be actively striving for it each and every single day. We're going to get some things wrong, we're going to get some things right, but ultimately each and every single day we're going to take one step forward and just drive the vision of Killer Chaos OS into the future, where we're going to be inspiring millions of people, and also having this redefining industry that we're going to create, and ultimately having $100 million worth of impact is just an arbitrary number, but ultimately this high level of impact that we're going to have into the future. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.